Hello, I'm Steve Ratcliffe and I'm a psychotherapist, and in today's video we're going to look at 10 tips to get the most out of graded exposure therapy. So first off, for those of you that don't know, graded exposure is a treatment that we often use in cognitive behavior therapy. It's very well tried and tested, lots of research behind it. It's really helpful for addressing all sorts of kind of problems related to anxiety and phobias. Um, and so you might be doing this within your own therapy that you're receiving, or it might be that you're trying to do it as a sort of form of self help. So, either way, these 10 tips will be helpful for you to get the most out of the process. Okay, so starting with number one, create a hierarchy. We call this sometimes a graded exposure hierarchy or an exposure hierarchy. It's essentially a list of different goals, different things that make you feel anxious, and you have them in a list from the toughest at the top down to the easiest at the bottom. It essentially sort of serves as a bit of a roadmap for you to be able to get the most out of your treatment. Because we don't want you to be starting on something that makes you feel very, very anxious, from the start. That'll be kind of jumping in the deep end, so to speak. We call that flooding, and that's really not helpful for you. Okay, number two, start small. I kind of touched upon it in point one then. Make sure you start small and work up from there. Make sure that they're realistic goals that you're setting for yourself. Now, they need to be challenging. They need to be things that involve facing your fears. You're going to feel anxious and uncomfortable. That's part of the process. But what you want to do is start on something that you feel is achievable, that might be a challenge, but is doable, not something higher up on your list that might feel just very overwhelming, because we don't want to set ourselves up for failing. So that's number two, start small and work from there. Okay, number three. Number three, it's really important that we understand the purpose and the nature of graded exposure. So often I see people hoping that they're going to not feel anxious, and if they do feel anxious, that they feel it's almost a failed task. Now, as I mentioned before, it's understandable and natural to feel anxious and uncomfortable. That's part of the process of it. If you weren't feeling anxious and uncomfortable, then you're not going for the right goal. You're not setting the right task for yourself. So we expect that, and that's actually part of the process for reducing your anxiety over time. So don't judge the exposure that you've done as a bad job or a bad exposure if you're judging it based on the fact that you felt anxious. That's not what we need to judge this off. We need to judge it on, did you manage to endure it? Did you manage to get through the process and go through that exposure, be able to experience that anxiety and ride that wave of anxiety that you felt and come to the end? Did anything that you feared might happen, did anything bad happen when you did that? There's certain reflections that you can take from this to decide whether that's been helpful for you or not. So don't judge it based on whether you feel anxious or not, because we expect that, and that's actually part of the process. Number four, make sure that you're waiting out your anxiety when you're in those moments. Sometimes it can be tricky depending on the types of exposure that you're doing. But what you want to see is you want to be able to expose yourself to the thing that you're fearing and stay in that moment for a length of time where that you can allow the anxiety to rise and to fall. Sometimes I find that people will do the anxious exposure. They'll go say experience say being in the room with a spider, and they will do that, and they'll sort of go into the room, they'll see the spider, they'll feel uncomfortable, and then they'll walk out, and they'll do that several times, and then they'll come to the session saying, yeah, I did it 10 times today, so I've kind of achieved my goal. But what we're finding is that we are going into the room feeling anxious and then coming out, we're not actually being able to learn to tolerate the discomfort and be able to ride out that anxiety, and that's a really key part of graded exposure. So staying in there, waiting it out until your anxiety starts to settle is really important part of the process. Okay, tip number five, make sure that you're repeating your exposures. It's really important that you do this as often as you can. Commitment and consistency is kind of key, really, to get the most out of this process. Okay, I find that people, when they're able to do that, they're able to get better gains quicker, and it's a lot more longer lasting. So just make sure that you are repeating the experiment or the exposure over and over again as often as you feel you're able to do. Obviously, sometimes exposures involve a certain monetary cost, or they involve certain time that maybe we might find difficult to have if we're working full time and things like that. So obviously, it's within your limits, but the more you're able to do it, the better. So just try to repeat that process. If, for example, there's a fear of, say, driving, if they've had a car crash maybe and they're trying to get back into the car and to be able to feel more comfortable driving, if they drive once a week and they're getting back in the car once a week to drive maybe around the houses in their local area, okay, that's great. We've managed to do it once a week. That's brilliant. But if you can do it once a day, or several times a day, you're going to find, even doing that same route and staying with that, with all the other points that I've made earlier, waiting that out, noticing the anxiety rise and fall, and repeating that over and over again, you're going to find you'll get better gains quicker. Okay, tip number 6. So make sure that you try to avoid any kind of distractions or safety behaviors. Okay, so when I describe safety behaviors, it's a bit of a therapy term, but it's anything that we find ourselves doing that makes us feel safe and alleviates some of our stress or anxiety in that moment in the short term, but it kind of leads to long-term downsides. So I guess an example of that can be things like I might be going into a social situation or a busy place that maybe makes you feel really uncomfortable. So a safety behavior can be things like listening to music, having my headphones in, listen to a podcast, or maybe taking a call. So I'm talking while I'm walking through maybe a busy area that makes me feel uncomfortable. What I'm doing there is I'm kind of distracting myself. I'm using these behaviors to make me feel a little bit safer, feel a bit more comfortable in that moment. And that allows me to get through that. But unfortunately, what that's doing is, although that helps me in the short term, I'm kind of still keeping the fear going. It's reinforcing the fear. It's making me feel that I can't do that task unless I am on the phone or unless I listen to music. So we have a bit of a crutch for these kind of distractions. So it's really important, if you're able to when you're doing your exposures, to try to avoid any distractions or safety behaviors. You'll be able to get a lot more out of the exercises there. Now, I guess there's one sort of caveat with this, is that relaxation can often be used, or sort of breathing exercises can be really helpful to be able to tolerate the discomfort and the anxiety that we feel. And they actually can be really helpful to be able to manage that exposure, to be able to get through it. So on one hand, it can be really helpful to do that, and I recommend it. It can be really helpful to be able to get through that difficult period and ride that wave of anxiety. For some people, though, it can almost become, if it's through repetition and become a reliance on that breathing exercise, that it can become almost a safety behavior. So again, if I don't do my breathing exercises, then I won't be able to cope. And that's not a belief that we really want you to hold on to. The anxiety, we want you to believe that the anxiety is going to pass whether you do breathing exercises or not. That's what we want you to be able to understand. But breathing exercises can help during that process and be able to achieve some of those goals that you've set for yourself. So it can be really helpful. Tip number 7. It's really important that you reflect after you've done your exposures. Okay, now reflection for some of you might come more naturally. For some others, you might not be used to kind of reflecting on our own thoughts and our own feelings, and what's been happening. It's really helpful to be able to reflect, because you can then use it as a motivation. So you can reflect on your successes. If you manage to do something that you would normally have avoided, that's fantastic. Like, it's great. You want to celebrate the success of that, and that can be used to kind of like sort of cheer you on for the next time you have to do that exposure. Also, be kind to yourself. It might be that you've had some setbacks. It might be that you've struggled with a certain, exposure exercise, and you found it really difficult to tolerate that discomfort. And maybe if you've come out of it a bit early, or maybe avoided it, that's okay too. Setbacks are part of the process. We can learn from those. Progress sort of comes in a gradual way. So just be kind to yourself when there are setbacks and there are challenges. That's okay. That's normal. But you know what, we can learn from this. So just feel free to tweak your exposures as well, to sort of see if you feel like I've taken on a bit of a big task here, there might be something you can do to just make it a little bit easier for yourself as a stepping stone to then get to that bigger task in time. Now, tip number 8, I mentioned reflection before. Well, this is also a form of reflection, and I want you to reflect on the negative thoughts and predictions that you had before you did that exposure. So the form of kind of graded exposure as a treatment is very behavioral. It's kind of very much around what we're doing. We're doing something to try and overcome our fears. So there's a behavioral element to it. But what can enhance your exposure therapy is using a more cognitive approach, which is about examining the sort of what you're thinking, the way you think about a scenario. And so maybe write down before you do your exposure, what do you fear is going to happen? Like, what do you think might happen? What are your predictions? What are your negative predictions, that you're worried about happening? writing them down, even maybe rating how much you believe it in that moment. So when you're about to go out to do that thing, what do I fear is going to happen? How much do I believe it's going to happen? And maybe put a percentage down. And then when you do that exposure, you can reflect on that after. Did that feared outcome happen? Did I think that bad thing was going to happen? Did it actually occur or not? And that's really helpful because you're able to spot when your mind is essentially getting it wrong, and that's just normal part of human nature. Our mind gets it wrong all the time, and so being able to spot when our mind's doing that and reflect on that can be really helpful, so that next time we get those negative thoughts, we can kind of understand, well, I've had that thought before and it maybe didn't happen, so I don't need to kind of believe it so much this time. So it can be a really helpful way to make you feel a bit more comfortable and address anxious thoughts. On that note, though, it's really important that you don't predict that you're going to feel anxious, because that would be a bit of an unfair prediction to put in there, because the whole purpose is that you're going to feel anxious or uncomfortable. So you don't want to come out of the experiment and go, yeah, you see, I knew I was going to feel anxious, I predicted it and it came true. That's part of the process of it. So that's not what we're talking about when we say negative prediction. It might be that something bad might happen, or that somebody might judge me or say something, or maybe I'll just be completely overwhelmed and I'll sort of shut down, or something, I'll be in danger or something bad might happen. And they're the kind of predictions that you want to sort of identify before you do your exposure. So tip number 9. For tip number 9, I've put down involve friends and family. Now, obviously, this depends on how comfortable you feel about that, whether you have supportive friends and family in your life. So, of course, you might take this with a pinch of salt, and you might not feel like it's an option for you. But for those of you that maybe have friends and family who maybe know a little bit that you're going through therapy, or that you're trying to work on this problem, involving them can be really helpful, because if they understand what you're learning about and the nature of kind of anxiety, understanding the nature of kind of graded exposure, how this kind of works, any handouts or sheets that you gained from your therapy, sharing them with friends and family can be helpful, because then they can motivate you and encourage you through your process. So they might be able to give you sort of reminders, or maybe give you a bit of a pep talk, or maybe they can help you with some of that reflection after you've done an exposure there. So it can be a really good opportunity for you to get the most out of your exposure work when you have people kind of in your corner supporting you, really. And sometimes for some people, they might take certain steps within their exposure hierarchy in their ladder that might involve going somewhere with somebody. So again, they can use a friend or a family member to go there, and they're going to work on that, and that might feel uncomfortable, and eventually they're going to then go by themselves without that family member. So that first step might be with a family member, and that might be helpful. So then being involved in this process can be really helpful. And finally, tip number 10. So I suggest that any of you who are going through therapy, you have your own therapist, and maybe you're going through this process of using graded exposure as your treatment. I've put down this for tip number 10, to be really open and honest with your therapist. It's really important as a therapist to be able to understand what's troubling you, how things are going for you when you're doing your homework. There is no judgment at all in the room. If you've ever struggled with anything, or you're finding any setbacks, or you're doing anything that you feel you're not sure whether that's right or if that's wrong or anything like that, please just be open and honest with your therapist. It's really helpful for us to understand what's going on for you, because then we can tweak and change what we're doing to be able to support you. If we don't know what's happening, if we don't know if you're struggling, then we won't be able to help you. And I guess in a way that if you are sort of fibbing or lying about the exposure, and saying that you might be doing it when you might not be, because you're worried about feeling any sense of shame or feeling judgment from us, I assure you, we won't be judging you at all. We're here to help you at the end of the day. So, be completely transparent and being honest with us. If there's any trouble, that's absolutely fine, because you can definitely work through those, and that's what we're here for. We're here to support you. So that will help you get the most out of your treatment, out of your time with your therapist. So I hope that's been helpful. That's my top 10 tips for getting the most out of graded exposure. Please feel free to comment if you have any other advice that you feel has been really helpful for you during this process. And if you found this helpful, feel free to like the video as well. That helps me understand what type of content is useful for you. And if this is your first time watching this video and you like what you've been watching, I'm going to be posting lots of different videos all about different ways to improve well-being and improve mental health, all from an angle of a psychotherapist. So if you think that'd be helpful for you, then please feel free to subscribe and click that bell icon to make sure you're getting all the notifications. I'll be putting out content every week. Okay, take care. Have a great day.